joke, if you'll forgive me, Father, is that if I do that, my hands don't glow in the dark anymore. Because if you're a good Anglo-Catholic and you know that you celebrate the Eucharist every day, it recharges your inner light. And because I haven't celebrated the Eucharist for 2 years, I'm afraid the batteries have run down a bit. And that's the kind of thing that theological students say. But it's indicative of a way in which that tradition of the daily Eucharist charges your spirituality. And I missed it so much. And as my Zoom colleagues will know, and unfortunately she's not able to be with us, Dr. Max Glucky from Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, a remarkable young woman, chemist and also Jesuit, wrote me this message on Facebook saying, what is the range of consecration? And if you consecrate and I want to be fed, why won't it work? And that notion about what does it mean for something to work is itself an interesting one. And that started off. And so I contacted a few friends, many of whom are on the screen, and said, well, look, let's just try this and see what happens. And that led to our Zoom communion, which has been going on now for nearly 2 years. And it's been a real privilege to have extraordinary services together. And it's reached across 5 denominations and 4 continents. So Baptist, Quaker, Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic. And we've had people in Australia, the States, in Estonia, in Paris, Virginia, DC, Washington, DC, and so on. And I try to, as Bishop Christopher just said, I try to do a personal odyssey through the first half of the book by looking into the tradition of saying, okay, shall we fast from the Eucharist? So what would it mean to fast from God's primary way of nurturing us? Should we do communion on our own? And to be fair to Bishop Christopher, I think my point about exclusion on the Chrism Mass was that actually, having just come back rather painfully from Manchester into Southwark to share in the Chrism Mass and the renewal of our vows with our bishop, I felt hugely included back in the diocese that I had served and loved and so on. It was great to be there sharing my vows with all of us, and we were all together, all one. And then, of course, came to the communion, and it was that disjunct. I wish to say, I had felt very included in the Chrism Mass up until that point. And so that led into all sorts of places I never thought I'd go, drive-in churches, and even more so the drive-through kind of, and what Robin came up with this wonderful phrase, the Luck Eucharist. And there's a wonderful cartoon in the book of a car by a sort of McDonald's thing saying that he would like a high church Eucharist with a Baptist sermon on the side. And then the person says, would you like a pew sheet with that? And then proceed to the hatch to make your offering and then pick up your Eucharist. Is that valid? And if not, why not? And so I was pursuing all of those questions in the material universe, and came to the conclusion that actually it was almost impossible to think how you could have communion under the pandemic in the material universe, which then took me into an examination of the digital universe. And I looked at the way in which the internet is another major communication revolution. And as with all communication revolutions, the church has jumped on the bandwagon. So as soon as people started putting paintings on cave walls or inscriptions on rocks, religion started getting on the act, but it was very much top down. The extraordinary thing was then about the invention of papyrus and the Roman world was the ease of communication. And the early Christians used the Roman roads and ease of communication, Paul's letters and so on, to their revolutionary new movement that actually turned the Roman world upside down in a couple of centuries. And then you jump forward to the printing press and the Reformation. And prior to that, of course, only clerks in holy orders, the clergy, could read or write, had the control of information. The printing press, and Tyndale was very common that I will make the boy who drives the plough to know as much of scripture as the proof. It suddenly became bottom up. And we had a thing called the press, which comes from printing press, who, of course, as we are seeing at the moment, hold government to account. And the internet started as a form of teaching and top down, very quickly started to become a bottom up, and then started to discover it could be side by side. And communities began to form online. And I'm very sorry that Simon Jenkins can't be with us today, because I think Simon was a real pioneer. He set up this rather scurrilous and student satire magazine called Ship of Fools in the 80s. It's actually based upon both Karl Barth and Plato's Republic. And the magazine is hilarious if you know it. But it then became a website. And during the period when Big Brother was the big thing, they invented an online arc and came up with the idea of, they invited people from all over the world, and they had 12 arc mates for 40 days and nights. And the public could vote as to who had to walk the plank. And immediately St. Paul and St. Peter fell out with one another, and St. Paul went off to his cabin and wrote a third letter to the Corinthians. And Paul was particularly upset by Eve, who was walking around wearing just basically a fig leaf. And it was very funny that actually the person who survived dry, somebody had to walk the plank each week. The one who survived dry was John the Baptist. And when the ark landed on Mount Ararat, and he received his 666 pounds in prize money, there was all his ark mates. But they turned the lounge of the ark into a church and started to do online praying. And from that came the Church of Fools, and from that came the Church of St. Pixels, which Martin Rowan and Malcolm Doney and others from St. Luke's were very involved in. So this was the early attempts to try to look at online worship. And Simon said, once we started moving our avatars and said, let us pray, I suddenly realized we were praying. And there is the Anglican Cathedral in Second Life. And I have an avatar in that. And Hezekiah, my avatar, sits in the chapel and prays on my screen while I'm writing at my computer. And there's online butterflies that fly around, and there's various online cats. And I can tell you that online cats are just like ordinary cats. They identify me as a felinophobe, I think is the word, somebody who can't stand cats, and all cats, but make a beeline for me. And this cat is called Demas, named after the companion of St. Paul. And when I'm praying in the chapel, Demas wanders in and plonks himself by my feet and purrs. And if I put my hand down and pat it, you can see his tummy going up and down. And it's an extraordinary feeling of, I've met these people who have their avatars in the cathedral. And I know them in real life, that one's in Canberra, several are in the Pacific side of the States, and so on. And we're praying for one another every day. They follow the Anglican offices and so on. It's a real community, but they can't share communion. And the two main ways in which we've been able to see communion happening online are through broadcasting and narrowcasting. Broadcasting, which is where, a bit like the television originally, but then now makes use of YouTube and Facebook and so on. And that's been very much the pattern that I discovered when I couldn't have communion in Manchester, that John and St. Luke's had gone online and were broadcasting the communion from St. Luke's each week. And I started receiving through that. And then there was the narrowcast of the small Zoom group. And so no more from me. I'm going to invite the Reverend Lizzie Campbell, who arrived as a new curate, a new deacon at St. Luke's about 3-4 months into the experiment. So to say a little word about how it felt to her coming into that situation and what goes on at St. Luke's. But then after her, we've invited Gordon Oliver, who helped to train me, and John for that matter, for the priesthood decades ago. Gordon's been very much part of the Zoom group, and I'm going to ask him to reflect on the Zoom experience. But so Lizzie.
Yes, hello, I'm Lizzie. I'm the curate of St. Luke's West Holloway, which forms the main case study of chapter 14. And so I'm reflecting on both that part of the chapter and my experience at St. Luke's and as a layperson during the lockdowns. Starting with the lockdowns, I think for me it was a real experience of deprivation, and one of not a lot of choice. The choice was made for me that I was going to have a very long Eucharistic fast, which, as someone who really deeply relies on the Eucharist as the foundation of my spirituality, was really tough, and that was not something that we knew really how to deal with, since there weren't many options. And even with the spiritual act of communion online as part of my theological college community, and also joining later on when I knew about St. Luke's existence, joining them as research on their Sunday morning Zoom Eucharist, I somehow felt that what I was finding was less than the real thing. And why did I feel that? Was there a foundation for that? And I'm not sure there was, because as Richard notes, those who participate remotely are participating in a real Eucharistic assembly. And yet we sort of went into the pandemic feeling like online life was not quite IRL, as we millennials like to say. It wasn't quite real life. And yet, because of the swiftly changing situations, we moved to offer something online for congregations in church. And quickly online life had to become real life. And the boundary between the two became much more fluid, and we started to realize that online was indeed real life. And that swiftness, although absolutely necessary at the time, means that we've got a few leftover conversations to have, theological discussions, practical discussions. And so for that, I thank Richard for this really timely and fascinating book, which I hope will prompt a lot of our communities to really discuss and consider deeply these ideas and problems and possibilities. Richard's asked me to speak a little bit on the discussion of time and space in chapter 14. As a physics nerd, time and space is something I think about a lot. And so my mind immediately went straight to time and space as dimensions of reality. But I think in liturgy, time and space are more often an experience rather than a physical fact. We can hold time and space for people in a way that is both asynchronous and dispersed. As Richard writes, if 1,000 years are but a day to the Lord, then why can't a service pre-recorded on Thursday be the same spiritual event as broadcast on a Sunday? In terms of physics, I agree with this perspective. If you consider time just like a dimension, like height or breadth or depth, then all time is equally drenched with God's presence, indeed Eucharistically so, whether the gathering is synchronous or asynchronous. And so I thought a little bit about the community that I've made and been a part of in the past 2 years, especially that of morning prayer, which we have at St. Luke's on Zoom, which has 2 sections. It has the synchronous Zoom prayer in the mornings, where we all come together on Zoom and pray with liturgically, but it also has the asynchronous sharing of images and prayers and experiences and sessions on WhatsApp, which actually is a really integral part to, I think, the community, especially for those who can't always make it at 9:30 on a weekday to pray on Zoom. And so these communities, we have these online encounters which resulted in deep friendships and support and love in a really difficult time. And to take that from daily prayer to the Eucharist, I don't think it's too much of a conceptual leap. And